Quick, think about the last thing that you bought. Now think about the last fantasy world that you interacted with. Could you have bought that thing in that fantasy world? Hello, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds. Today, I would like to discuss economics in fantasy. Fantasy Economics 101, if you will. Before we get into it, thank you very much for all the subscribers. YouTube has given me my own URL, which you can see, Just in Time Worlds. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do hit that subscribe button for more fantasy world building content. Okay, let's get going. What I'm going to discuss today is the impact of economics on a fantasy world. So I'm going to break my discussion down into the three major types of economic systems, and then I'm going to discuss the impact that they would have on a fantasy world and how they have been implemented by fantasy authors. Then in the end of the video, I will talk to specifically how to decide what fantasy economic system will work best for the world that you are trying to build. Let's get cracking. First, we need to understand something about economic systems. There are three major types of economic systems, and no, socialism and capitalism does not form part of this discussion. The three major types that I'm going to discuss today is the traditional economy, the market-driven economy, and the command economy. So the differences between those are that the traditional economy, your government is largely completely uninvolved in your economy. In the market-driven economy, you have a functioning market that functions on two big assumptions, which your government is charged with keeping in place. And in your command economy, you have your economy being planned from a central organization. Now, I'm going to delve into each of those separately. If one of them is more important to you than the others, and you're not interested in hearing all about the others, I do use chapters in my videos. So if you check the red play bar, you can see that there are specific breakpoints that you can skip to in the videos. And they are all labeled, so if your interest is in one and not the others, feel free to skip ahead and skip onwards. Okay, let's hit it. Now, first I want to talk about traditional economies. So traditional economies are economies where your government's involvement in the economy is nil to very low. These economies can be your barter style economies and your subsistence farming style economies. So in this case, what you would have are economies where every household is basically an independent entity that farms for itself and that trades with the households around it in order to find goods that they cannot manufacture for themselves. Typically in this type of economy, your cities are small and there are very few cities. You also quite often have barter in this kind of economy. Sometimes you even have entities paying their taxes in kind, so rather than in money. You might in fact have a very money poor kind of society in these kinds of societies. This kind of economic system is characterized of sort of the early Middle Ages. It's also characterized by feudalism to an extent, where you're trading labor as a kind of economic activity. And an author who does it very well is Catherine Kerr. So she actually has her peasants pay their local lord taxes in goods. So they bring their cheeses and their breads and so on to their lord's castle to pay their taxes with. And money, is very scarce and tight, especially on the borders. So, when for example, there's a scribe who needs ink, They actually, the Lord has to really consider whether he has enough coin to pay for ink from one of the few big cities that is days travel away. So it's not just a case of popping over to the store. So that's the kind of characteristic of that level of traditional economies. However, traditional economies don't begin and end with that kind of coin poor environment. Traditional economies, because you have so little government involvement, lend themselves to the rise of monopolies, the rise of trading organizations, and powerful guilds. So, a great example from our own history is the Hanseatic League. And I made a short about them, which you can check out over there in the info card, which will tell you a little bit about them in 1 minute. Now, the thing to remember as well about guilds, and that what people often misunderstand about them, is guilds were not actually primarily about quality. I know that that's often what's said, like the guild's there to ensure quality. The guild systems arose as a means of protectionism. So if there was a baker's guild in your city and you tried to start an independent, non-gilded baker's shop, the guild would come and sabotage your shop. They would burn your premises down. They would put weevils in your meal. Like, these are the kind of activities that guilds engaged in. They were not these associations of happy-go-lucky, let's all share quality and innovation. Quite the contrary. And so in a traditional economy, that's typically what you have arising is monopolies and trade organizations and guilds. Because it is more profitable to control more of the market. Like, that's just basic finance. So if you are not prevented from controlling the market, you will control the market if you can. So there are a lot of fantasy authors who have a heavy guild environment. I use guilds myself in my world because when I was designing the Empire of Lumiaron, which is the world that I write in, I wanted that heavy guild presence. I wanted the politics that go with guilds. So I in fact have two different guilds that both serve in the performing arts. The Bardic Guild, which was the original guild, and then eventually the Players Guild, which arose as a competitor to the Bardic Guild, which is all in the background of my world building. And the reason why I did that was because I wanted that interaction of the one not liking the other and the competition between the two guilds to serve as a backdrop against the larger guild war, against the larger conflict in my novels. So using organizations like guilds as a backdrop or as driving force for plot is actually a really handy mechanic in fantasy world building. And it is one of the reasons why the traditional economy is so attractive, because you can ignore what a government would do and just have your economy run on these models that create enormous conflict. And of course, conflict creates plot. But you can also go into your market-driven economy. Now, people often make the mistake of thinking that a market-driven economy means that you have no government interference. No. That is a traditional economy. A market-driven economy means that your government must ensure that markets are open and functioning optimally. Now, this over here is the supply and demand curve. It is a model which says that as your supply increases and your demand decreases, your price should decrease. As your demand increases or your supply decreases, your price should increase. And so you find a equilibrium point, which is the price that the good is optimally worth, because your suppliers and your consumers are in agreement on the price. This is often called the invisible hand of the market, and it was a theory first proposed by Adam Smith, who was a Scottish economist who lived in the 18th century. Link to Wealth of Nations down below if you want to read it. So the interesting thing about this model is that a lot of people look at this model and they go, okay, so that's free market, right? No. See, the thing about this model is it has two huge assumptions. Yeah? Assumption number one, everyone has the same information. You have perfect information. What that means is that whether you're a buyer or a seller in the market, you know how much is available in the market in terms of supply, and you know what price the buyers are offering. And assumption number two, there's perfect competition. You have no monopolies, you have no oligopolies, you have no price fixing shenanigans. Yeah? When those two assumptions are met, this model works. And that is the role of your government in a market-driven economy. Yeah? It's to ensure that you have that model. Now, I'm sorry for the long explanation around this model, but the impact that it has on your fantasy world is this. In order to ensure that those market conditions are met, you're going to need a bureaucracy. Like, it doesn't just happen by magic. Monopolies do exist. If you think about the United States and at the early turn of the 20th century when Teddy Roosevelt broke up the monopolies, you can see very clearly that you need a bureaucracy, you need a legal system, you need a means to break up those kinds of monopolies to ensure that your market is actually functioning. And that introduces a whole new level of plot points, right? Because bureaucracies are always interesting. Bureaucracies consist of people. People can be bribed. People can be convinced to look the other way. People can be blackmailed into looking the other way. And for years, that was the case with the big monopolies. There are very few examples of market-driven fantasy novels. I am going to turn to urban fantasy and one of my favorite authors, Jim Butcher, as an example. Obviously, urban-based economies, urban-based fantasy novels are set in our world predominantly, and as such have got as much market-based economies as we have. Speaking of bureaucracy, the last economic system that I want to discuss today is the command economic system. Now, here you are really going to have to let go of your 20th century prejudices. Because the Soviet Union failed, the assumption tends to be that command economies will always fail. The Soviet Union being typically held up as a command economy because that's what communism is. But if you go back to the Bronze Age, you'll see that a lot of what we know there, we think that they ran on a command economy system. And the reason why was because they had these big cities. I mean, Uruk, Babylon, Avaris, all of them were over 80,000 to 100,000 inhabitants, which doesn't sound like much now. But if you think about the technology level that they had available to them in the Bronze Age and the fields and fertility of the ground that they had to work with, that is a huge number of people to feed with your agricultural surplus. So what those economies did was they had a command of what the farmers should grow and when they should leave the fields fallow, how much water they would have. If you even look at the Bible in Exodus 23 verse 10 to 11, it speaks there of every 7 years you must leave your field fallow. Now, that is a central authority, in this case, the religious central authority, instructing you in economic activity. And that is a command economy. You often see this kind of economy used in post-apocalyptic settings. And the reason why is the same reason as why we believe it was implemented in the Bronze Age. If you have scarce resources that have to be utilized with care, a command economy is your best bet. In the Bronze Age, they had to provide a huge surplus to feed the cities. In post-apocalyptic worlds, you often have to husband your resources carefully in order to feed your population, in order to house your population. And quite often what also happens in these post-apocalyptic worlds is it's not actually a government that's taken control. It might be that there was a company that survived and that company became the government. That's how Patrick Tilley does it in his Amtrak Wars, where Amtrak survived the apocalypse and they created the government as a command economy where everybody works for them, for Amtrak. It's actually a great series of books, recommended if you can find it. Not that easy to find, unfortunately. Okay, so those are your three main economic types and their impacts on fantasy worlds. Let's talk about how you decide which one you should implement and how. The first question you need to ask yourself is what level of impact do you want your economics to have on your world? If you want it to have a minimal impact, or if you want to have a low money society, a more barter orientated society, traditional economy is the way. If you want heavy guild presences and powerful trade organizations, traditional economy is the way. If you want a lot of red tape and bureaucracy around enforcing free market trade and you want lesser impact of guilds and you want to reduce the impact of trading organizations, market driven all the way. And if you have a scarcity of resources that have to be managed well in order for your society to survive, command economy all the way. And that is my take on economics in a fantasy world. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please do hit the thumbs up if you did. And I will see you next week for another episode of Just in Time World.